Paris, July 25th, 1944. A young woman climbs the stairs of a quiet apartment building in the 8th arrondissement. She's 23 years old, small, dark-haired, unremarkable in any way that matters. She carries a leather satchel. She knocks on the door of a safe house she trusts. Nobody answers. She lets herself in. The apartment is still. Dusty afternoon light comes through curtains she was told never to open. She sets her bag down on the table, pulls out the radio transmitter, a compact thing about the size of a shoebox, and begins to unfold the wire antenna. She has an urgent message to send to London. Her network commander told her to wait. He said it was too dangerous right now. She knows that, but the message cannot wait. She has been in France for nearly 5 months. She has transmitted 105 messages to London in those 5 months. 105 times she sat at that radio, fingers moving over the Morse key, and got away with it. She will not get away with it this time. As she finishes encoding the message and begins to transmit, she hears something, a thump, from the apartment next door. She stops. Her hands go still over the key. She starts packing up the equipment fast, rolls the antenna wire, destroys the slip of paper with the message written on it. Another thump. Footsteps, then silence. She exhales, breathes. Maybe it was nothing. Then comes the banging on her door. Not a knock, a bang, the kind that means they are not asking. She opens the door. A man in a dark coat stands in the hallway, pointing a pistol directly at her face. Behind him, more men. The apartment is searched in minutes. They find the radio. They find the gun. They find just enough to end her life, or what she has been living of it. Her name is Eileen Nearne. Her code name is Rose. And despite everything that is about to happen to her, the torture, the concentration camp, the forced labor, the death marches, the escape through a frozen forest, she will never give up a single name. Not one. Gentlemen, welcome back. If you're the kind of man who respects courage, real courage, not the Hollywood kind, then you've come to the right place today. We are going to spend the next hour or so talking about a woman who was smaller than most men's wives, quieter than most, who lived so deep inside a lie that she barely knew herself anymore. And then they broke her door down, and she had to decide, in real time, under real pain, who she was going to be. This is the story of Eileen Nearne, Agent Rose, one of the most extraordinary undercover operatives of the entire Second World War. And odds are good that you have never heard her name. That's going to change today. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let me tell you about a young woman who sat in a torture chamber on the Rue des Saussaies in Paris, came out the other side, survived a Nazi concentration camp, escaped through the snow with 2 strangers, and then spent the next 65 years of her life quietly, alone, never asking for credit, never getting much of it either. Let's go back to the beginning. Eileen Mary Nearne was born on March 15, 1921, in London. She was the youngest of 4 children. Her father, John Nearne, was English. Her mother, Marie, was Spanish. They were a close family, a bilingual family, the kind that blurted out words in 2 languages in the middle of a sentence without noticing. They had humor and warmth and a traveling sort of life that most folks in those days would have called unusual. In 1923, when Eileen was barely 2 years old, the family packed up and moved to France. That was the move that changed everything, because it meant that Eileen grew up not as a tourist in France, not as a foreigner who learned French from a textbook, but as someone who lived in the language. She went to school in French. She made friends in French. She dreamed in French. By the time she was a teenager, you could not tell from her accent, her mannerisms, or the way she laughed at a joke that she had been born across the channel. That fluency was going to save lives someday. but not before it nearly cost her her own. The Nearne family settled into French life the way families do when they are not in a hurry to leave, gradually, completely, like furniture that fits the room so well you stop seeing it. They lived in Paris for stretches and traveled through other regions of France as well. They had the particular ease that bilingual families carry, a comfort with crossing cultural lines, with being a little bit of everything, and fully committed to none of it all at once. It made the children adaptable. It made them fluid. It made them harder to pin down. Eileen's older sister, Jacqueline, was sharp, serious, and fiercely protective of her little sister. They were close in a way that sisters can be when they share a language and a life that not many people around them would understand. People who knew them both in those years described them as inseparable in some ways and very different in others. Jacqueline was the organized one, the methodical one, the one who planned things out. Eileen was quieter, more internal, the kind of person who observed more than she spoke. She watched, she catalogued, she stored things away. Her brothers, Francis and Frederick, were both older than her, and both of them would eventually work for British intelligence in the war. Francis joined the SOE. This was a family that produced fighters. They just didn't know it yet. Then the summer of 1940 arrived, and the world these kids had grown up in stopped existing. May 10th, 1940. Nazi Germany launched its invasion of France. 6 weeks later, France surrendered. It was one of the most stunning military collapses in modern history. The French had the Maginot Line, a fortress along their eastern border that they had spent years and hundreds of millions of francs building. The Germans went around it, through Belgium, through the Ardennes forest, that French military planners had said could not support an armored attack. They were wrong about that, catastrophically wrong. Here is what the fall of France looked like on the ground, because I don't want this to be an abstraction. In May and June of 1940, millions of French civilians and refugees from Belgium and the Netherlands took to the roads heading south and west. Historians call it the Exodus. 8 to 10 million people, grandmothers, children, farmers, shopkeepers, politicians, priests, all walking or driving or riding bicycles south on the same roads, carrying what they could, leaving behind everything they could not carry. German aircraft strafed those refugee columns. The roads were chaos. And then France fell, and it was over. The armistice was signed on June 22, 1940, in a railroad car at Compiègne, the same railroad car where Germany had surrendered to France at the end of the First World War in 1918. Hitler had that car brought out of a museum specifically for the occasion. He stood in it and let himself feel the weight of the moment, the reversal of humiliation, the settling of a score. It was theater. But it was also a message, and every French person understood it. Paris fell on June 14, 1940. The swastika went up on the Eiffel Tower, and just like that, the France that Eileen Nearne had grown up in, the cafes, the boulevards, the schoolyards, the bookshops, all of it was now under German occupation. There were checkpoints, there were curfews, there were German soldiers on French streets, German orders printed in German on French walls, German officers sitting in French restaurants while Frenchmen and women walked past and kept their eyes down. The Nearne parents stayed in Grenoble in the south, which was in the Vichy zone, technically unoccupied France, though that was a distinction that got thinner and more meaningless by, the day. But Eileen and Jacqueline were not willing to wait around and see what occupation looked like up close. Getting out of France in 1940 was not a simple thing. It was not a matter of buying a train ticket. It required nerve, connections, money, and luck. And even then, at any checkpoint along the way, a wrong answer could end things. Eileen and Jacqueline made it through. They went south through Spain, through Barcelona, then Madrid, then Lisbon. From Lisbon, they eventually made their way to Gibraltar and back to the United Kingdom, back to London. When they arrived, Eileen was 19 years old. She had left England at age 2 and come back at 19, a young woman, fluent in French, carrying nothing much but her nerve. The British government was, at that moment, desperately looking for people just like her. Now here is where this story gets into territory most people don't know much about, because most people never got the full picture from their history classes. So, let me fill you in, because you need this context to understand what Eileen walked into. Winston Churchill, in the summer of 1940, was looking at a map of Europe and seeing nothing but Nazi flags. France gone, the Low Countries gone, Norway gone, Denmark gone, the Soviet Union still technically neutral, the United States not yet in the war, Britain standing essentially alone, with the Luftwaffe bombing its cities every night and German submarines strangling its supply lines at sea. Churchill was not a man who sat still when he was losing. He set up a new organization in 1940 called the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. Its mission, as Churchill described it in characteristically plain language, was to set Europe ablaze. What that meant in practice was sending trained agents into Nazi-occupied France, and eventually other countries, to build underground resistance networks, sabotage railways and factories and fuel depots, gather intelligence on German troop movements, and in general, make the Nazis' lives as difficult and dangerous as possible behind their own lines. This was not conventional soldiering. There were no fronts, no uniforms, no rules of engagement in any traditional sense. If you were caught, you were not a prisoner of war. You were an enemy combatant operating without uniform in occupied territory, which meant the Geneva Convention did not protect you, which meant the Gestapo could do whatever they wanted to you. And they usually did. The SOE had a problem in the early years. France was occupied. German soldiers were everywhere. A new face, a man of military age wandering around and asking questions, drew attention. The Gestapo were watching. The French milice, the French collaborationist police force, sometimes even more brutal than the Germans, were watching too. Women drew less suspicion. A woman on a bicycle was a French housewife going to the market. A woman with a bag might be a secretary going to the office. A woman chatting with someone in a cafe was just having a coffee. Women could move more freely, carry messages more freely, be seen in places without triggering the automatic alarm bells that followed a man of military age. There is something both inspiring and unsettling about that calculation, and I think it is worth sitting with for a moment. The British government deployed women into mortal danger, in part because the Nazis underestimated women. The SOE used that blind spot as a weapon. The Germans assumed that women were not fighters, not spies, not agents capable of maintaining a clandestine radio network for months under occupation. That assumption was wrong, and it cost them. So the SOE began recruiting women. Not many of them at first, just a handful, carefully selected, carefully trained. They would be trained in wireless transmission, in coding and decoding, in the use of weapons, in evasion and escape, in how to build a cover story that would hold up under pressure. They would be dropped into France by aircraft with false identity papers and cover stories that had to be maintained 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, under occupation, under scrutiny, often under fire. The training took place at different country estates around England that the SOE had commandeered for the purpose. There was a school in Scotland for physical conditioning and basic weapons handling. There was a school in Hampshire for tradecraft. The practical arts of living a double life, of surveillance and counter-surveillance, of making dead drops and conducting secret meetings in public places without being noticed. There was additional training in demolitions and sabotage, in parachuting, and in the operation and maintenance of the wireless radio sets that operators like Eileen would carry concealed in suitcases or hidden under floorboards. This was not classroom learning. It was practical. They put you in real situations and watched how you handled them. They sent instructors to play the role of Gestapo agents and try to break your cover story in improvised interrogations. They staged fake arrests to see how long you could maintain your composure. If you cracked, they pulled you out. Better to fail in training in England than to fail in real life in Paris. 39 women served as SOE agents in France during the Second World War. Not all of them came home. 13 were captured, 12 were sent to concentration camps. Some of them were executed. Eileen Nearne was going to become one of them, but she didn't know that yet. Back in London, Eileen had initially taken a job doing clerical work. She was offered a position in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, working on barrage balloons, the big gas-filled cables stretched across the city to entangle German bombers. She turned it down. That wasn't the kind of contribution she wanted to make. Her brother Francis joined the SOE. Her sister Jacqueline was recruited by the SOE and eventually sent to France as a courier. Eileen found out because siblings are bad at keeping secrets from each other no matter how much their handlers tell them to, and knowing what her sister was doing must have set something off in Eileen, because she applied to join as well. The SOE interview process was nothing like what you'd expect. There was no formal application or board of directors. A man named Selwyn Jepson, who had been a crime novelist before the war and went back to writing crime novels after it, was one of the key interviewers. He would sit down with candidates and talk. Not interrogate, talk, have a conversation. And while the conversation happened, he would be taking the measure of the person across from him. What was he looking for? Steadiness, the ability to hold a lie without flinching, a kind of quiet self-possession that would not buckle under pressure. Not recklessness, but nerve. There is a difference. Reckless people got sloppy. People with nerve stayed calm. He could usually tell the difference. What the SOE brass thought when they first looked at Eileen Nearne is not entirely clear from the existing records. She was small. She was young. She was, by some accounts, a little scatterbrained. The word that actually appeared in one official assessment. She was described as not suitable in at least one early evaluation. But that assessment turned out to be spectacularly wrong. Because before she was sent to France, she spent time working as a home-based signals operator in London, receiving coded messages from agents in the field. Silent work, repetitive work, requiring tremendous concentration and accuracy. She excelled at it. She had the hands for the Morse key, and she had the patience. Both are rarer than you'd think. She was commissioned into the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, the FANY, which was the cover organization the SOE used for its female agents. On paper, she was a nurse, not an intelligence operative being trained to evade, deceive, and transmit secret messages from behind enemy lines. Her training was serious. She learned hand-to-hand. She learned weapons handling. She learned how to build a cover story and stick to it, how to identify surveillance, how to lose a tail on a city street. She learned the codes. She learned what to do if captured, which was, officially, to hold out for 48 hours before talking, because 48 hours was considered enough time for a network to go dark and move. 48 hours. That was the expectation. Hold out for 48 hours. Eileen would hold out for much longer than that. In the late hours of March 2nd, 1944, she boarded a Westland Lysander aircraft at a Royal Air Force field in England. The Lysander was a small, single-engine plane designed for short takeoffs and landings in tight fields, which made it perfect for sneaking agents in and out of France under cover of darkness. It was not a comfortable aircraft. The passenger sat in a rear compartment, mostly alone, watching the dark English countryside fall away below, and then the Channel, and then the darker and more dangerous countryside of occupied France. She landed in a field near a village called Saint-Valentin in the Indre department of central France. She stepped out onto French soil, carrying false identity papers identifying her as Mademoiselle Dutour, alias Jacqueline Duterte, alias Alice Wood. To the Gestapo, to the milice, to the occupation authorities, she was a French civilian. Her real name was Eileen Nearne. Her code name was Rose, and she had a job to do. The network she was joining was called Wizard. It was run by a Frenchman named Jean Savy, and it had a slightly different purpose than most of the SOE networks operating in France. Wizard was not primarily a sabotage network. It wasn't blowing up railway lines or taking down power stations. Its focus was on organizing sources of finance for the French resistance, money, financial, infrastructure, the unglamorous plumbing that an underground war runs on. The resistance needed funds to pay for safe houses, to support the families of arrested fighters, to bribe corrupt officials when the opportunity arose, to forge identity documents, to sustain the daily operations of a network that could not operate openly. Wizard was, in a sense, the bank. Not as dramatic as blowing up a bridge, but no less important. Eileen's job was to be Wizard's radio operator. Her task was to maintain the wireless link between the network in Paris and SOE headquarters in London. Every message that went back and forth had to go through her. She had to encode it in the proper cipher, transmit it at the right time on the right frequency, and then pack up the transmitter and disappear before the Germans could triangulate her signal, because the Germans were listening. You need to understand what it was like to be a radio operator in occupied France, because most people have no real idea. The German intelligence services, specifically the Funkabwehr, the radio counterintelligence unit, had detection vehicles parked around Paris and other major cities. These were trucks carrying direction-finding equipment, and they drove slowly through neighborhoods listening for the distinctive signals of clandestine transmitters. The moment a signal was picked up, multiple vehicles would converge from different directions, triangulating the source. The process took time, but not unlimited time. The standard guidance to SOE radio operators was, transmit sessions should be as short as possible. Change locations frequently. Never transmit from the same place twice in a row. Never transmit longer than you have to. The moment you sat down at that radio and started sending, a clock started running. Eileen knew all of this. She had been trained on all of it, and she followed the rules, mostly. Over the next 5 months, March through July of 1944, she transmitted 105 messages to London. Think about that number for a moment. 105 times she sat down in a safe house somewhere in Paris, plugged in that transmitter, extended the antenna, and started tapping out Morse code to London. 105 times she had to find a safe location, make the transmission, pack up, and vanish before the detection trucks triangulated her signal. This was not theoretical danger. This was daily, grinding, nerve-shredding, right on the edge of the cliff danger. Every single transmission was potentially her last. And what was happening around her during these 5 months? The war was accelerating. Jean Savy, the head of the Wizard Network, had left Paris to travel to London with crucial information about German V-1 flying bombs, the unmanned buzz bombs the Germans were preparing to launch against England. He left Eileen effectively functioning alone in Paris as the network's communications lifeline. He didn't know, as he flew home in his Lysander, that the same aircraft had taken his sister, and that sister turned out to be Eileen Nearne, who had just completed 15 months in France as a courier. Two sisters in the same airplane, both going in opposite directions in this war. Eileen stayed. She then worked for another network called Spiritualist, maintaining the radio link to London. The weeks passed. The Allied landings at Normandy came on June 6, 1944. D-Day, the invasion that the entire French resistance had been preparing for, fighting toward, dying for. The crack in the dam. Everyone in the resistance knew the Germans were now on the defensive, that the clock was running out on the occupation, that liberation was somewhere over the horizon. But the Germans were not done yet, and neither was the Gestapo. Now, if you're enjoying this story so far, and I hope you are, because this woman is something else, here's a good time to ask you something. If you've been watching this channel, and you haven't subscribed yet, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button. It takes about 2 seconds, and it tells YouTube to keep showing you stories like this one, real stories, forgotten heroes, the kind of history they never quite got around to teaching you in school. You can hit the bell too, so you know when the next one drops. I'd appreciate it. All right, back to Paris, July 1944. Things were getting dangerous. The detection vehicles were getting better. Networks were being infiltrated. There were arrests. The Gestapo on the Rue des Saussaies was processing resistance and SOE agents at a terrifying pace that summer. The word was out. Lie low. Don't transmit unless you absolutely have to. Eileen's network commander told her explicitly. Wait. Don't transmit. It's too hot right now. She had a message that couldn't wait. July 25th, 1944. She went to a safe house she trusted. She set up the transmitter. She started to send. And then she heard the thumping from next. Oh, door. And then the silence. And then the bang on her door. Here is what happened next, as clearly as can be reconstructed from her own later accounts and the historical record. Eileen opened the door. The man with the pistol pushed in. Other men followed. They went through the apartment methodically. These were professionals. They knew what they were looking for. They found the radio transmitter. They found her gun. They loaded her into a car, handcuffed, and drove her to the Gestapo headquarters at 11 Rue des Saussaies in Paris. The Rue des Saussaies. If you know anything about occupied Paris, those 4 words carry weight like a punch in the stomach. That address was where the Gestapo conducted their interrogations, and by interrogations, I am not using a euphemism for a stern conversation. I mean torture. Systematic, professional, methodical torture designed to extract names, addresses, radio frequencies, codes, the information that would allow the Gestapo to roll up entire resistance networks, arrest dozens of people, send them to camps or to firing squads. One of the methods used at the Rue des Saussaies was called the baignoire, the bathtub. It meant holding someone's head under water repeatedly to the point of near drowning, over and over. Each time they brought you up, they asked questions. Each time you refused to answer, they put you back under. The psychological terror of it, on top of the physical agony, was designed to obliterate a person's capacity to resist. There were other methods, too. Sleep deprivation, bright lights, the slow, grinding pressure of questions asked over and over in the same room, at the same table, by men who had done this hundreds of times before. Trained interrogators who knew exactly how long a person could hold on, who knew which threads needed pulling, who were patient in the way that predators are patient. And underneath all of it ran the specific technique that the Gestapo relied on perhaps more than any other, The promise that cooperation would be rewarded, that things could be made easier, that the names they were asking for were already known anyway, and your silence was only making things worse for yourself. That last part was often a lie, and Eileen knew it. She had been trained on it. A post-war report by an SOE officer described what Eileen endured with a particular kind of understatement that was common in official British documents of the era. He wrote that she survived in silence the full revolting treatment of the baignoire at the Gestapo headquarters. In silence. Let that sit there for a second. This 23-year-old woman sat in a Gestapo torture chamber on the Rue des Saussaies and endured the full revolting treatment. In silence. The SOE training had told their agents, hold out for 48 hours. That was the number. Hold on for 48 hours, because in 48 hours the networks could go dark and people could move and safe houses could be evacuated. It was an acknowledgement built into the training that eventually everyone breaks. The 48 hours was not an expectation of heroism. It was a practical minimum, the amount of time needed to limit the damage. Eileen was in Gestapo custody for weeks before they sent her to Ravensbrück. She did not give them 48 hours' worth of names. She gave them nothing. She told them she had been transmitting for a French businessman, that she had not known he was working for the British, that she was just a wireless operator for hire, a technician, not a spy, that she had been deceived. It was a thin story, extraordinarily thin. But Eileen sold it. She held her cover under physical and psychological pressure that would have broken most people immediately, and she sold it. The Gestapo didn't entirely buy it, but they couldn't entirely disprove it either, and without further evidence, without a name they could trace back to confirm she was a British agent, they could not immediately execute her. On August 15, 1944, 21 days before Paris was liberated, Eileen Nearne was transferred from the Rue des Saussaies to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Ravensbrück. For those of you who maybe haven't heard that name much, Ravensbrück was a Nazi concentration camp about 50 miles north of Berlin. It was the largest camp in the Nazi system specifically for women. At its peak, it held over 40,000 prisoners. The conditions were designed to destroy people: the overcrowding, the starvation rations, the forced labor, the arbitrary punishments, the medical experiments, the regular selections that sent women to be gassed or executed. 4 SOE female agents were executed at Ravensbrück in early 1945: Violette Szabo, Lillian Rolfe, Denise Bloch, and Cecily Lefort. They were 28 years old, 22 years old, 37 years old, 43 years old, shot in the back of the head or injected with phenol for doing the same work Eileen had done. Eileen arrived at Ravensbrück in August 1944. They shaved her head. They gave her a prisoner's uniform. They told her to work. She refused. That is not a small thing. Refusing to comply in Ravensbrück was not an act of passive resistance. The guards told her bluntly, "If you continue to refuse, you will be shot." She refused anyway. She was a prisoner of war, she told herself. She did not work for the Nazis. No, she had no legal protection from the Geneva Convention. She knew that. But it was a way of holding on to herself, of not surrendering her identity completely, of refusing to be just a number on a platform. Let me tell you what Ravensbrück actually looked like from the inside, because the word concentration camp has become so abstracted in the decades since the war that it does not always convey what it actually meant to be there. Ravensbrück was built in 1939 on the shore of a lake in northern Germany, about 50 miles north of Berlin. The surrounding countryside was, in a grim irony, quite beautiful. Pine forests, still water, the kind of North German landscape that in any other time would have been peaceful and unremarkable. At its peak, Ravensbrück held over 40,000 women from across all of occupied Europe. French resistance fighters, Polish intellectuals, Soviet soldiers, Dutch Jews, Belgian nurses, Roma women, German political prisoners. Women who had been arrested for 1,000 different reasons, all of them amounting to the same thing. They had, in some way, refused to accept what the Nazis demanded. The barracks were designed to hold a fraction of the number actually packed into them. Sleeping shelves 3 levels high, sometimes 4 women sharing a bunk meant for one. The food ration consisted primarily of turnip soup and a small amount of bread, not enough to sustain health at the labor levels the camp demanded. Women were assigned to work in the camp's workshops, in nearby fields, and at the Siemens electrical factory, which used prisoner labor throughout the war. I want you to sit with that one for a moment. The same company whose appliances are sitting in your kitchen today was running its factories on the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners in 1944. Beatings were arbitrary and constant. Roll calls were held twice daily and could last hours, regardless of weather, as SS guards counted and recounted the women standing at rigid attention in the cold. Infirmary care was a fiction for most prisoners, and in 1945, as the Allied armies advanced and the Nazis moved to eliminate evidence, a gas chamber was installed and put into use. She survived the punishment for refusing to work. She was then transferred from Ravensbrück to a forced labor camp in Silesia, in what is now Poland, where conditions were even grimmer and the work was brutal. Factory work, the kind designed to use people up and discard them. Women in these camps typically had a life expectancy, measured in months once their physical reserves were depleted. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you. Seriously, a lot of people, they click away during the hard parts. They don't want to hear about the camps, about the torture. But here's the thing, gentlemen. If you want to understand what this woman was, what her courage actually cost her, you've got to sit with the hard stuff for a minute, because this is the part that matters. This is the part where you find out who somebody really is. And here's another thing. If you're finding this story meaningful, if you think stories like this deserve to be told, deserve to be heard, deserve to be passed along to the next generation, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel exists because of viewers like you who believe that. Don't let this story end with you. Now, where were we? Silesia, 1945, early spring. The war was visibly ending by late 1944. The Soviet army was advancing from the east with terrifying speed and force. The Allied armies were pushing into Germany from the west. The Nazi regime, which had conquered most of Europe in less than 2 years, was now in its death convulsions. Hitler was in a bunker. German cities were being bombed into rubble. The Reich was collapsing, but the camps were still running. The guards were still there. People were still dying. The Nazis, as they retreated, began moving prisoners westward on death marches, forcing concentration camp inmates to walk hundreds of miles in winter conditions, in insufficient clothing, with minimal food, killing many of them through exposure and exhaustion, shooting those who couldn't keep up. These marches killed tens of thousands of people in the final months of the war. Eileen Nearne was on a work gang in April 1945. She was in bad shape by then. Months of captivity, starvation rations, forced labor. She had been through it all, and she had not come out the other side physically unscathed. She was barely 24 years old, but she was carrying the weight of several lifetimes, and yet she was still thinking, still watching, still, somewhere underneath everything, the trained SOE operative who had learned to look for the exit. On April 13, 1945, she escaped. She escaped with 2 French women from her work gang. She doesn't appear to have planned it far in advance. It reads more like an opportunity appeared, and she recognized it in the moment and moved. The three of them broke from the work party and disappeared into the forest. Think about what that meant practically. Hiding in the German countryside in April 1945 meant cold nights, no food, the constant possibility of running into SS units or German Home Guard forces who had been ordered to shoot anyone suspicious on sight. The forests weren't safe. The roads weren't safe. Everything was dangerous. But staying in the camp, with the war clearly ending and the guards growing more unpredictable and desperate, was also a death sentence. They moved through a town called Markkleeberg. They were arrested again briefly by SS forces, but Eileen used the exact same skill she had used on the Rue des Saussaies. She held her cover. She talked. She acted like a confused French civilian with no understanding of why she'd been detained. It worked. They were released. She eventually reached Leipzig, one of the major German cities in the east, which was in the process of being encircled by American forces. There she and her two companions were sheltered by a Catholic priest who hid them in the church until the Americans arrived. American soldiers liberated Leipzig on April 18, 1945. Eileen Nearne was free. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. VE Day, victory in Europe. The bells rang across London. People filled the streets. Churchill spoke from a balcony. King George VI addressed the nation on the radio. After 5 years, 6 months, and 3 days of war, it was over. In that celebration, in those crowds, among all the people who poured onto the streets of London and wept with relief and exhaustion and grief and joy, somewhere in there were the people who had fought it in silence. The SOE agents who came back, the ones who would never talk about what they had done, not at parties, not at family dinners, not ever. They had saved the country in ways the country would never fully know, and most of them were fine with that. They had not done it for recognition. They had done it because it needed doing. After the war, Eileen received her MBE and her Croix de Guerre. She moved in with Jacqueline. They were both back in London, both decorated, both carrying things they could not put down. After the war, Eileen Nearne received the French Croix de Guerre, the War Cross, awarded for valor in combat against the enemy. She was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire, the MBE, by King George VI himself. The citation said it succinctly, for ses services in France during the enemy occupation. Her citation from the SOE files praised her cool efficiency, perseverance, and willingness to undergo any risk. Cool efficiency, perseverance, willingness to undergo any risk. Translation: she was tortured by the Gestapo, sent to a concentration camp, transferred to a forced labor camp, marched through a collapsing Nazi Germany, escaped through a forest, got arrested again, talked her way out, and then hid with a priest until the Americans showed up. All of that is cool efficiency and perseverance. She went back to London. She moved in with Jacqueline, her sister, in the flat they shared for the next decades. They were the only two Nearne siblings who had been in the field for the SOE. They had both survived, which was more than could be said for others. They had each other. And, for a while at least, that seemed to be enough. But here is what the official record doesn't tell you, what the history books tend to gloss over when they talk about these women, what the medals and citations don't mention, what the war did to them. You know, I think about the men in our audience, guys who are 60, 65, 70 years old or more, and I know that a lot of you have been through your own hard miles. Some of you served in Korea or Vietnam. Some of you came home from those places and found that home didn't quite fit anymore, that the things you had seen and done and survived had changed the shape of your interior life in ways that were difficult to explain to people who hadn't been there. Some of you carried that for decades without ever once bringing it to a dinner table or a family gathering because there was no way to translate it, and you weren't sure people could handle it even if you tried. You know what it is to carry something heavy and quiet, something you don't talk about. Eileen Nearne carried that weight for 65 years after the war ended. The New York Times, when they finally ran her story in 2010, put it plainly. She suffered from psychological problems brought on by her wartime service. That is the clean, clinical language of an obituary, and it does not begin to cover it. What that phrase describes is a woman who had been systematically tortured, imprisoned in one of the worst concentration camps in the Nazi system, transferred to a slave labor facility, forced through a death march, escaped through a winter forest, and then been handed a medal and sent back to civilian life with no support structure, no acknowledgement, no understanding from anyone around her of what she had been through. She did not talk about it. She could not talk about it, not in any real way, for decades. There were no trauma counselors waiting when the SOE women came home, no support groups, no clinical language for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The British government thanked them, gave them medals, and sent them back to civilian life. Figure the rest out yourself. Some of the SOE women wrote memoirs. Some became public figures. Odette Sansom, who had also survived Ravensbrück, was the subject of a 1950 film. Virginia Hall eventually got recognition from both the American CIA and the French government. Their stories were told and retold. Eileen's was not for a long time. In 1997, 52 years after the war ended, she agreed to appear in a television documentary about the SOE women. The program was called Time Watch. She came on camera. She wore a wig, so her face would not be clearly recognizable. She spoke in French, not English. She used her wartime code name. She was Rose, not Eileen. Rose. Even half a century after the war, she could only discuss it from behind the identity she had built to survive it. She had become Rose so completely in 1944 that when she finally let anyone see, it was still Rose who showed up. Think about what that tells you about what the experience had done to her. The survival mask had fused to her in ways she couldn't entirely separate. The disguise and the woman had become the same thing, or close enough that there was no clean line between them anymore. Her sister Jacqueline died in 1982. After that loss, whatever anchor had held Eileen's daily life in place for the previous 37 years shifted. Jacqueline had been the one other person in the world who had some frame of reference for what they had both been through. Not the same experiences, but the same organization, the same risks, the same particular texture of living under constant threat and maintaining a lie. When Jacqueline was gone, that particular kind of fellowship was gone too. Eileen moved out of London. She went to the seaside town of Torquay in Devon, a quiet place on what the English call the English Riviera, beautiful cliffs, calm water, a mild climate by British standards. Nothing much happening. She rented a flat overlooking the water. She settled in. She was 61 years old. She lived there quietly for nearly 30 years. Her neighbors, the shopkeepers she dealt with, most of the people who knew her, they had no idea who she was or what she had done. They saw an elderly English woman, slim and private, polite and self-contained. They did not know about Paris. They did not know about the Rue des Saussaies. They did not know about Ravensbrück or Silesia, or the frozen forest near Leipzig, or the priest who hid them until the Americans arrived. She went to church. She walked. She kept to herself. She was the elderly English lady at the end of the road, and all the while, in a drawer somewhere, the medals sat. The MBE, the Croix de Guerre, the papers that told the story she did not tell. In 1993, she made one significant public appearance. She traveled to Ravensbrück with a small group of former SOE agents and members of the Special Forces Club. They went to dedicate a plaque to the 4 female SOE agents who had been executed there in 1945: Violette, Sabo, Lillian Rolfe, Denise Bloch, and Cecily Lefort. Eileen had known some of them. She had trained alongside some of them. She had survived when they had not. Standing at that plaque, in that place, must have required a courage of a different kind than anything she had done in 1944. She went back to Torquay and continued her quiet life. By the time she was in her late 80s, she was frail. Her health was declining. She lived alone in a flat overlooking the water. On a day before September 2nd, 2010, Eileen Nearne died alone in that flat of a heart attack. She was 89 years old. Her body was not found for some time. When she was eventually discovered, the local council workers who came to search her flat for next of kin found something in a drawer: medals, papers, documents relating to wartime service. They could not make much sense of them at first, but they were enough to start asking questions. The council, preparing what at that point looked like it would be a pauper's funeral, brought in researchers. And that is how the world found out who Eileen Nearne had been. The story broke slowly, then all at once. The newspapers picked it up. The BBC, The Guardian. The New York Times ran a story with the headline that essentially captured what so many people felt when they read about her. Eileen Nearne, wartime spy, dies at 89. That was when most people heard her name for the first time. Her niece, living in Tuscany, Italy, was located through a British television program called Heir Hunters, which traces the estates of people who die without a will. The niece said she was upset that Eileen had been portrayed as dying alone or unloved. She said she had visited her aunt just 6 months before her death. She said Eileen was always cherished by her family. And that is worth emphasizing. She was not abandoned. She was not entirely alone. She had family who visited, who loved her, who knew her as Aunt Eileen, not as Agent Rose of the SOE, not as the woman who had survived the Rue des Saussaies, but as a person they were glad to know. The dichotomy of that is important, because the public narrative that emerged, the lonely spy, forgotten and unrecognized, tells only part of the truth. The other part is a woman who had made a life, imperfect and marked by the past as it was, but hers. But she had kept her secrets. She had lived her private life, inside herself, in a way that even the people who loved her could not entirely reach. The war had given her a set of walls that she never fully came down. At the point this happened, I want to stop for just a second once more, because if you're the kind of person who believes that these stories matter, that the lives of people like Eileen Nearne deserve to be remembered, deserve to be passed along, deserve to outlast us, then let me ask you right now to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already done it. We put out one of these stories every week or so. Real history, real people, told straight, with respect. If that's the kind of content you want to see more of, hit subscribe. It's the biggest thing you can do to help us keep making these. I appreciate every single one of you who does it. Now, let me tell you about the funeral. The Torbay and District Funeral Service of Torquay offered to provide Eileen Nearne's funeral free of charge. The eulogy was delivered by Adrian Stones, the chairman of the Special Forces Club, the private members' club in London for people who have served in clandestine operations. That is a club with very strict membership requirements. Your application requires that you have been involved in special operations or have materially assisted them. Eileen Nearne had been a member. Of course she had. Her body was cremated. Her ashes were scattered at sea, as she had requested. The English Channel, perhaps. or the Devon sea that she had looked at from her window every morning for 30 years. Gentlemen, I want to take a few minutes here to think about what Eileen Nearne's story really means, not as a history lesson, as something more personal than that. You know, I think about some of the men who watch this channel, guys who served, guys who came home from hard places and found that home felt different, felt wrong somehow, felt like it didn't quite fit what they'd been through. The war changes you. Whatever kind of war it is, military combat, the daily battles of hard work and hard loss and hard years, it marks you in ways that other people can't see. Eileen Nearne came home from an experience that most people will never grasp, and then she spent 65 years living inside that experience, trying to be normal, trying to be the quiet English lady who just happened to have a drawer full of medals and a story she never told. She held her line in the Gestapo headquarters on the Rue des Saussaies, under the baignoire, under the lights, under the pressure that was specifically designed to make human beings stop being themselves and become something the interrogator could use. She held her line. She didn't give the Gestapo the 48 hours they trained agents to aim for. She gave them nothing, not a name, not a safe house, not a network, not a frequency, zero. They tortured her, sent her to Ravensbrück, transferred her to a slave labor camp in Silesia, watched her refuse to work, then eventually shipped her off on a march she escaped from. And even after all of that, she came home and was quiet about it. That is a kind of strength that doesn't have a good modern name. It's not toughness in the gym sense. It's not resilience in the therapy speak sense. It's something older and harder and rarer, the ability to carry an enormous thing for an entire lifetime without letting it crush you and without needing applause for doing so. Her sister Jacqueline received more recognition in the years immediately after the war. Jacqueline was perhaps more outgoing, more willing to be seen. Eileen stayed in the background. When the Time Watch cameras finally came and she agreed to speak on record, she did it in disguise. That's who she was. The National Archives in London hold her SOE personnel file. When those files were eventually opened to the public, what came out confirmed not just the bare facts of her missions, but the character of the person behind them. The citation for her MBE praised her explicitly for cool efficiency, perseverance, and willingness to undergo any risk. The SOE files describe how she handled her arrest and interrogation, how she managed to maintain her cover story under conditions that were specifically designed to make it impossible to maintain anything. There is a line in the reporting about her that appeared in the Independent newspaper after her death was made public. It called her the scatterbrained spy who helped win the war. It is a headline that irritates me a little, if I'm honest with you. Scatterbrained. One internal SOE assessment had used that word, or something like it, before she proved them wrong. The newspaper remembered the early assessment. The reporter forgot to mention the part about the Gestapo torture chamber and the concentration camp. Let me fix that right now. Eileen Nearne was not scatterbrained. She was iron. She was built from something that did not bend when the Gestapo applied everything they had to bending it. Look, it is now 2025, 80 years after the end of that war. Most of the people who were directly involved are gone. The physical evidence fades. The cities that were rubble are rebuilt and rebuilt again. The camps are mostly just foundations and memorial plaques now, and the number of people alive who can say they were there shrinks every year. And there is a real danger in every generation that the stories get thin and vague and eventually vanish altogether, become statistics, footnotes, names on a list that nobody reads anymore. I want to be clear about what is lost when that happens. It is not just history. It is not just information. What is lost is the human weight of the thing. The particular reality of a 23-year-old woman sitting at a radio transmitter in a Paris apartment, knowing the detection vehicles are circling, finishing the transmission anyway, packing up the equipment with hands that aren't quite steady, and then hearing the bang on the door. That is not a statistic. That is a person. That is the kind of courage that most of us, if we are honest, are not sure we would have. And it deserves to be remembered with the specificity and the respect it earned. That is what we are here to prevent. That is why this channel exists. 39 women served as SOE agents in France during World War II. 13 were captured by the Germans, 12 were sent to concentration camps. Some were executed. Most of them received recognition that was quiet, late, and insufficient. None of them became household names. For every Virginia Hall, whose story is now fairly well known, there are half a dozen Eileen Nearnes whose names most people still haven't heard. That is a failure, not of history. History recorded what happened, but of transmission, of memory, of the decision made or not made to pass these stories forward. Eileen Nearne was awarded the MBE. She was awarded the Croix de Guerre. She lived to 89 years old, alone in a seaside flat in Devon, with a drawer full of medals nobody saw until the day she died. She watched on a television screen from her flat as the world moved forward and forgot. She deserved better than that. She deserved whole books, whole documentaries, parades. She deserved to be known. Let me tell you something about the men and women who are forgotten, about what it means to live a life of quiet service and have it go unacknowledged. There is something in the human spirit, something you and I both recognize, I think, because we're at an age where we've seen it. That requires acknowledgement. Not fame, not celebrity, just the simple human recognition that says, "We see you. What you did matters." For Eileen Nearne, that recognition came late, too late to fully repair the damage of its long absence. When the newspapers ran her story in September and October of 2010, when the Special Forces Club came to give her a proper send-off, when the broader public finally learned who she had been, it was all posthumous. She was not there to hear any of it. But I want to push back on the narrative of the lonely, forgotten spy, just slightly, because there is another way to read this story. Eileen Nearne chose the life she lived after the war. She chose Torquay. She chose the quiet flat. She chose not to write the memoir, not to do the interview circuit, not to be the public face of anything. Whatever combination of trauma and personality and deliberate decision-making put her in that seaside town with her medals in a drawer. It was her life, and she lived it on her own terms. And when she did finally speak on camera in 1997, she did it in a way that was completely her own. Her wig, her French, her code name, Rose. On every level, until the very end, she controlled the story. Here is what I know. Somewhere in that quiet life in Torquay, behind the wig and the French voice and the code name she kept for 50 years, she knew exactly what she had done. She knew she had sat in that chair on the Rue des Saussaies and not broken. She knew she had walked out of Ravensbrück when others had not. She knew she had transmitted 105 messages to London without getting caught, and then on the 106th had only gotten caught because she believed the mission was worth more than her personal safety. She always believed the mission was worth more than her personal safety. That is not a small thing. That is the entire thing. Now, there is one more detail I want to leave you with because I think it matters. When Eileen's flat was searched after her death, the council workers found the medals and the papers, but they also found something else: notes, personal documents, the kind of material that a private person keeps in a private place and never shows anyone. Among those documents were records that confirmed in specific detail the operations she had been involved in, operations that had never been publicly disclosed in full, missions whose details had been sealed in classified government files for decades. The released SOE files at the National Archives paint a portrait of an agent who was, in the dry language of official assessment, of great value to the organization. What that meant in practice was that the messages Eileen had transmitted from Paris in those 5 months of 1944, those 105 transmissions, had carried intelligence that directly informed Allied planning. Information about German troop dispositions, about supply lines, about the movement of V-1 flying bomb components that eventually helped the Royal Air Force target those facilities. She was not just keeping a network alive, she was keeping a flow of intelligence moving that was feeding directly into the war effort. Her code name was Rose. In France, in the summer of 1944, she had been Rose, cool, precise, sending the dots and dashes of Morse code into the night, maintaining the lifeline between the resistance and London. After the war, she was still Rose, more than she was ever Eileen again. Rose was the one who could talk about it, if only in French, wearing a wig after 50 years. Eileen Nearne, Agent Rose, died on a date that remains uncertain, but was before September 2, 2010. She was 89 years old. Her ashes are at sea somewhere off the coast of Devon. The medals are held by her family now. The files are in the National Archives, and her story, which almost became just a council burial in a pauper's grave in Devon, is now being told to you. A man points a pistol at a young woman's face in a Parisian apartment doorway in the summer of 1944. She looks at the gun. She looks at the man holding it. She breathes, and in that moment she makes a decision, quiet, total, unspectacular from the outside, that she is going to maintain for the next several months through torture and concentration camps and frozen forests and everything the collapsing Nazi empire can throw at her. She is not going to give anyone up, not one name, not one address, not one frequency. One should not ask a spy what it cost her, but we can honor the fact that the cost was real, that it was paid over the course of an entire lifetime, and that names like Eileen Nearne should be on the lips of anyone who calls themselves a student of the Second World War or a student of what human courage actually looks like. And now they are on yours. If you got all the way to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you being here. We covered a lot of ground today. Hard ground, some of it. But that is where the truth about human courage lives. Not in the easy stories, not in the clean victories, but in the long slog, the quiet sacrifice, the decision made alone in a small room that nobody else ever witnesses. Before you click away, if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, right now is the moment. We put out stories like this one every week. Real history, real people. Told straight, with the respect these lives earned. If that is the kind of content you want to see more of, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And if this one moved you, if the image of Eileen Nearne sitting at that Morse key in a Paris safe house, or sitting in that interrogation room and not breaking, or sitting in her flat in Torquay with her medals untouched in a drawer, if any of that stayed with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. That is how these stories survive, person to person. The old-fashioned way. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.